My name, like I said, is Sierra Lapointe, and I am a second-year master's student with the Center for South Asian Studies. My research concerns the preservation and transformation of Tibetan Buddhist tradition in the American cultural context.
And my name is Mark Dovich. I'm a first-year master's student with the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. My research focuses on assessing political participation by members of the Crimean Tatar minority in Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Sierra and I are particularly excited for today's event because perhaps like many of you, we've decided to pursue careers outside of academia. In planning this event, we recognized that there are many students on campus who are interested in hearing about paths outside of academia, and we hope that this event is a step toward generating that conversation.
So with that in mind, let us introduce our panelists. First, we have Amber Forbes. Amber is an international development specialist with nearly a decade of experience representing U.S. interests at diplomatic and development agencies. Currently a senior advisor at the Inter-American Foundation, Amber works directly with the CEO to promote inter-office collaboration and implement agency-wide strategies. Amber previously worked at the Department of State as a civil service employee in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs for 7 years. She spent her first 3 years as a public affairs specialist in the Bureau's Office of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and later accepted a position as a social development officer in the Bureau's Office of Economic Policy and Summit Coordination. Excuse me. In this role, she managed more than $3.5 million in presidential initiatives promoting women's entrepreneurship and social protection throughout the hemisphere, and was a member of the negotiating team for the Summit.
The
Seven Summit, the Seventh Summit of the Americas. During her tenure at the Department of State, Amber completed a 6-month rotation as a program officer at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where she managed $277 million El Salvador Investment Compact. Amber holds a master's in public affairs from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, where she focused on international development. She earned her bachelor's degree from University of Michigan, where she double majored in poli-sci and Latin American and Caribbean studies.
Next we have Cortney Meier. Courtney is the communications specialist for Harvest Plus at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. Harvest Plus improves nutrition and public health by developing and promoting biofortified staple crops rich in vitamins and minerals. She draws on experiences as a storyteller, project manager, researcher, and editor to translate research and knowledge into impact and outcomes. Passionate about ending malnutrition, she has worked with the non-governmental organization Helen Keller International, communicating their holistic efforts preventing malnutrition and blindness. And she volunteered with the humanitarian organization Million Meal Movement to run meal packs and organize an annual Million Meal Marathon. Courtney is also a longtime volunteer and leadership seminar chairwoman with Hugh O'Brien Youth, a nonprofit dedicated to inspiring young people to become analysts for positive change. Courtney graduated with distinction with an MS in Development Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, England. She also holds a BA with honors in Economics and Management and International Studies from Albion College in Michigan. Following graduation, she interned with the U.S. Department of State at the U.S. Embassy in Paramaribo, Suriname.
And finally, we have Fernando Snowden-Lorence. As a vice president in global philanthropy, Fernando leads the Fellowship Initiative in New York. Created by JPMorgan Chase in 2010, the TFI, which is the Fellowship Initiative, is a nationally recognized youth development program that prepares young men of color for academic and professional success. Fernando manages the curriculum, partnerships, budgeting, and internal collaborations for the program. In addition, he has contributed to a number of employee resource groups, including Vets, Bold, and Pride. He has served as their co-chair, as the co-chair of the Advocacy and Community Partnerships Committee for the Hispanic and Latino Business Resource Group, Adelante. A veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Fernando served in the United States Marine Corps and Marine Corps Reserve for 9.5 years, where he held the rank of Staff Sergeant. Before joining JPMorgan Chase, Fernando spent 15 years working in education, volunteer management, and political advocacy, and he was an entrepreneur in the nonprofit and youth development fields. He has held senior leadership roles in regional nonprofits working throughout the Northeast, focused on community and civic engagement, next-generation learning models, and educational diversity. He holds a BA in organizational anthropology and philosophy from Hunter College and lives in Brooklyn, New York with his wife.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. before we get into our questions, there we go, thanks. Before we get into our questions, could each of you take a few minutes and expand on what it is exactly that you do and how you became involved in a globally engaged career? Amber, why don't you get us started?
There you go.
You are.
Great.
No.
Nope.
No. Now you go.
There.
Technical
Got it, I'm
difficulties. Great, thank you so much. As they mentioned, my name is Amber Forbes. I'm currently a senior advisor at the Inter-American Foundation. And if I could, I'll just take a moment to say what that is, because I know it's a very small U.S. agency that not many people know about. But in my very biased opinion, I think it's one of the coolest U.S. agencies. It's a tiny, just 40-person independent U.S. agency that focuses on grassroots development in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the organization has a rolling call for proposals in which underserved grassroots communities can apply to the foundation, identifying their own development challenges and their proposed solutions for those challenges. And the foundation then looks through the proposals, selects the ones that they think are most viable, and then partners with those communities directly, not working through implementers, to realize those projects. It's a very sort of bottom-up approach to development. It listens and is responsive versus sort of a top-down, we'll tell you how to fix the problems we think you have type of model. And so I've really enjoyed working there. I've been there about 6 months, and as these guys mentioned previously, I was with the State Department for about 7 years. And so in my current role as a senior advisor, I focus a lot on inter-office communication. I work directly with the CEO, trying to break down silos between offices. I lead some organization-wide initiatives. For example, we have our 50th anniversary this year as an organization, and we're looking at how to leverage the occasion of our 50th to amplify what we currently do, how to get additional funding so that we can expand our reach to additional communities in Latin America and the Caribbean, and just reach other partners to do the same. I also do a little bit of program analysis with our Office of Learning and Impact and our program office. And so in terms of how I got here, as they mentioned, I started at the State Department. I actually started at the State Department when I was still a student at the University of Michigan. I did the Michigan and Washington program, which, if you don't know, is a fabulous program, and I highly recommend it. It's kind of like studying abroad, but in DC. So you get U of M credits, if you have scholarships or financial aid, all of that transfers. So it gives you a nice soft landing in DC with other U of M students. And so I was interning at the Department of State there while I was doing this program, and I did it my senior year so that I could stay. And then I got a job at the Department of State after that internship and slowly worked my way up through the Department of State. The press office was sort of the job that was open when I needed to find a job. And then I slowly made my way to econ, which was a little more in line with my interests. And then from that econ job, I was able to move over to the Inter-American Foundation. And this is really, I think for me, what I was hoping to do when, back when I was undergrad. It took me about 10 years to kind of get the dream job, but I really love what I do, and it's to be in a development-focused agency that is also responsive. And I'm happy to talk later about sort of how that career path took shape and some of the opportunities and challenges I faced. But I think for now, I'll turn it over to Fernando so you can talk about yours.
Thank you. I will try to be brief. Fernando Snowden-Lorence, I'm from New York originally, from Brooklyn, and I, as was mentioned, Vice President Global Philanthropy at JPMorgan Chase, which is Chase Bank. And I am responsible for college and career readiness, youth programs. The fellowship initiative is really kind of our crown jewel. But the team that I work on is called Workforce Initiatives. That's the focus area. So the firm has 4 focus areas in its global philanthropy. One is workforce, and that is specific to youth, anywhere between 16 and 24, 25, or younger adults, like some of yourselves, and those transitioning. So talking about transitioning from one skill set to another. Maybe a sector is starting to shrink, maybe there are layoffs in a certain company, and so we want to be able to support training programs that help people skill up on something else, learn something new. So that's the team I sit on. As I said, I focus on youth. So I'm really on that 16 to 24-year-old team that focuses on teens in particular, and then those graduating, getting into college, graduating from college, finding internships, getting into their career path. And as a philanthropy, we focus on supporting organizations. So That has to, finding partners, collaborators regionally, globally. Our workforce initiatives span the globe, so anywhere from coast to coast in the U.S., any commercial market where the bank or the firm is engaged in, we're also looking for nonprofit, community, and government partners to help support these programs that we manage. So it is a global, it's an opportunity to be globally engaged for folks who are thinking about the potential to be on the for-profit side, and particularly work, as crazy as it may sound, for a bank at some point to try to do good. So I mentioned where I work. I manage this program. I do direct service. So one of the things that surprises people, even where I work, is to hear stories about the kids that I work with, because we don't just kind of sign checks and say, great job, go off and do good work. We actually get involved in site visits. We work with the students directly. We bring them into our offices. So that's a lot of what my day is about, in promoting their success and promoting what they do, and making sure that people understand that these public-private partnerships, which is a big part of what we're trying to establish, are critical. I've said before, and I won't get on this stump too much now, but companies are starting to realize that consumers, that our clients, customers, that the general public wants to know not just that they're providing service or doing good, or I should say doing a good job at providing a service, but who they are in the community, and what kind of representation, the people they do business with have in the community. If you're doing terrible things, and large corporations are doing a little bit of good and they're doing a little bit of bad, maybe I don't want to be engaged with you. Maybe I don't want to bank with you. And so I'm definitely someone who feels that he's a part of a movement towards greater understanding of that and greater transparency in the private sector. And really quickly, how I find myself here, it is not a straight line. It's a winding road, as you heard in my biography. I was in the military for a number of years. For me, that was an access point, a way to get more exposure to the world than what I had when I was in East New York and Brooklyn. And it was incredibly helpful for me to kind of get a better sense of the world beyond my block, beyond my neighborhood, so that I could even actually put myself into context in New York and understand what it, kind of what the overall community was, and what some of the differences between myself and others were. So that was really critical. And I studied anthropology and philosophy, so to this day, people still look at me sometimes and go, oh. Or when I first had those degrees, and I was looking for work and I wanted to be engaged in community, I worked in nonprofits for 10 or 15 years, people would literally tell me, and you found work? You found a job, with that degree? And within those majors, I studied specific things. Honestly, I studied things like language and gender. I had specialties in specific parts of the world. Anthropology is famous for wanting to study a specific cultural scenario. And so a lot of people thought, what are you going to do with that? You have to teach. You've got to become a professor. And I pursued that for a minute and then thought, but I want some practical experience. I don't want to just go into academia, and I have not been working in the field. So it's been a winding road, and I say all that because while I was I was deployed in the Marine Corps, I had a situation where I arrived in a country and realized, along with some of the other folks in the service with me, that we knew nothing about where we were. We didn't come out with a lot of language skills. We knew almost nothing about the culture, and couldn't communicate, and struggled to create rapport and understand what was going on. And that lack of communication created a lot more conflict. And that is what brought me back to school, to make sure that I would be better at understanding culture and the values that come from that. So it's a very winding road. I'll try to be more explicit later. Now I am here. So, Courtney.
I am a communication specialist on a program called Harvest Plus that's based at the International Food Policy Research Institute. I've been there now for about 15 months. And in a nutshell, I'm a political economist that communicates about the impact of this nutrition and agriculture program. Harvest Plus, as you heard, is enhancing the nutrient content of staple crops like rice, maize, cassava, to improve nutrition and public health outcomes. So what that means for me is that I liaise with plant breeders and advocates and nutritionists to translate knowledge and research and outcomes across disciplines to a variety of audiences to convey beneficiary research and policy impact. I also advise and support colleagues in the field in our offices around the world as they create demand with consumers, supply with farmers, and advocate to policymakers. In terms of how I got there, it's also been a little bit of a winding road. I spent a bit of time at a global service organization that was doing a lot of work connected to global health issues. And then I shifted to global health and nutrition organizations. But as you'll hear later, to me, volunteering is something that's really important. I've always felt that it was a small way to sort of create the type of world that I wanted to live in. So that's why I got involved with Million Meal Movement, because I wanted to be able to feel like I could do a little bit to stem hunger before I could sort of shift to working on preventing malnutrition. So I am trained as an economist, but as I grew up, I started to grow to see the consequences and the damage of malnutrition in terms of disability and disease, and that's when I started working more in public health. I've always been this really nerdy, curious person, but I didn't want to be doing research just for the sake of learning myself. I wanted to know that the research that I was going to be connected to could be used to develop evidence-based strategies that would help create change, which is why I ended up in non-governmental organizations and then in policy research institutes. So I'm sure we'll go into more detail as we go on, but just to give you a sense of how that all sort of played out. For me, the jobs that I got were largely based on connections that I had and name recognition of the organization. So sort of every job that I took opened up another door that made it possible for me to get a little bit further to where I see myself going.
Great. Well, thank you all for those insightful answers. We'd like to continue basically the conversation on the same theme. So, it's very common nowadays for professionally successful individuals like yourselves to have many different jobs over the course of their career. And so can each of you tell us a little bit more about your professional trajectory, how your humanities and social science backgrounds led you into the professional world, and how you navigated the many sort of transitions along the winding road that led you to where you are today? Did you start out with a clear idea of what you wanted to do and where you wanted to go? How did that idea change over time as you were presented with new opportunities and new challenges? Yeah, whoever would like to start, yeah.
Well, I think I definitely touched on, I didn't start out, obviously, with the intention of ending up where I am today. I think I started out with a sense of where I thought I'd be most effective and what I thought was most important to me. And I studied anthropology and philosophy because of that. I had a lot of people telling me, why don't study that? That is not going to give you the widest range of potential careers. It's not practical. And I needed to focus on what I thought would drive me to be my best in school. And these are the things that I loved and was passionate about and wanted to learn about. Felt like there was impact to be had in people understanding, being able to communicate something about culture, about human beings, and about what's happening in a particular situation, particular part of the world. And so I use that, to a great extent, that sense of connection, even though it wasn't a vision everyone else could see. It wasn't something that everyone else understood, building that community, that network, learning other individuals who are interested in that. I didn't have a huge group of people around me that are like, social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and particularly thinking about the variety of things that you can do with that afterward. And I held on to that to some extent in the sense that this is what I care about. I'm going to have to find a way to make an impact on the world with these skills. And I learned quickly enough, interestingly enough, I'm sure many of you have probably seen this, that being able to communicate, one of the things that you'll pick up in any social science or any humanities is the ability to build muscle in certain communication skills. You've got to be able to write in a lot of these disciplines. You've got to be able to present in many of them. You've got to be able to distill information in all of them, and a lot of it. You know, the way we've built our structure is you've got to be able to absorb tons of information, written, spoken, do your own research, and I think perhaps most importantly is think critically. That is thrown around all over the place, but I wonder how many of us feel like every room we walk into, there's a lot of critical thinking going on, you know? And that's in a myriad of different professional environments. And so I took those skills, I felt like, and you have to test yourself a little bit. There's certainly some uncertainty, some concern. If you're not in the workforce yet, where is my lane? Where's my comfort zone? And if I am in the workforce, maybe I'm not where I want to be. I'm not having the impact I want to have. And so testing yourself a little bit and using that curiosity to find out, what is this like? If I work for an international aid organization, if I work for a foundation, what is that like? And what role do I play in those spaces? So I did that. I was obviously motivated by my experience on deployment in these particular areas and came back and thought, I'm from this particular community in New York, and so that's where I started to build my professional career. My experience was working with communities in New York and working with individuals who had similar experiences to mine, and then learning how I could take those skills and build those out. And so my responsibilities over time grew because I was passionate about what I was doing. And there were times though when I was in an organization I was very quiet, right? And people were like, well, this guy doesn't talk a lot, doesn't sell himself very well. But I was working. And so I was getting something out of it, even if, the recognition isn't always what you might expect, or, a lot of praise in staff meetings. And then there are other professional scenarios where I had learned to speak up a little bit more, to advocate for what I was doing because I thought it was important. And as that took shape in the education space, a lot of organizing. At first was a community organizer, did community development, then moved on to policy because a lot of us who were in that space then decide, well, it's got to be able to relate to the government, got to start getting in their face, got to go up and lobby. And then kind of just the system itself, I kept pulling back my lens, wanting to understand more and more and more of how big the picture really was. And I think that led me to this space. And I have a lot of friends, we talked about this yesterday, that were just stunned when I was like, got this offer from this bank. And were like, what? Because I was not working in a space where that was considered, the morally upright environment. That was not a mission-driven environment. That was a profit-driven environment. And so there were some people, just as we discussed yesterday, that had a very hard time accepting that. And so my communication level dipped. But certainly my friends and people who knew me understood. I have a certain mission. And so I was able to take these skills into that space in a discrete way. And it's critically important to what I mentioned earlier, and then I'll wrap up here, that people understand with the level of communication where it is, we all want to know what role we're playing, what lane we're in socially, and we want to know the companies that we work with. And we need to pull companies into that space. We need to pull them in. We need to change a paradigm that says we're on the kind of receiving end of what a profit-driven society is about, not on the decision-making end, and that's not really true. So I think that is extremely ranging answer to the question, but I can be more specific at a later time.
So I guess to play off of that, when I had a conversation with Sierra yesterday, and she mentioned, looking at my LinkedIn profile, it looks like all of my jobs have been this very perfectly curated sort of line that you tend to hear people talk about in terms of the building blocks to their career. But the truth is, much like Fernando just mentioned, that wasn't necessarily my intention going forward. I think what set me on my current path actually started in undergrad. I said that my senior year was spent in DC, but that's not necessarily true. My senior year I actually missed due to a traumatic injury that left me unable to attend school my senior year. And I had enough credits to graduate, but I didn't feel like I was ready to graduate. And I wanted to see what else the University of Michigan had to offer me, and so I had sort of 6 months where I couldn't walk, and sort of to rethink what I was doing with my life and have that existential question of, oh, what do I do when I graduate? And I decided that I wanted to go to DC to see what the international relations, international development space was about, because those two terms are so broad. And I know it's, people talk about international development and international relations, but it's kind of hard to say what exactly that is and like what do those careers look like. And so I went to DC, and I ended up working at the State Department because that was the internship I had gotten at the time, and it was a paid internship, and DC is very expensive if you don't have a paycheck. So that's where I started, but I'd never envisioned myself working for the US government. I had taken a lot of classes while at U of M that were very critical of the US government, and I felt like, you know, I was going to work for the man, and, you know, I really envisioned myself at like a nonprofit or Peace Corps, living in a hut somewhere, doing grassroots development. And here I was working at, you know, this massive institution. But what I found was that the people that I was working with were very mission-driven, very dedicated to making the world a better place. And public affairs wasn't really what I wanted to be doing, but I was learning a really valuable skill set. And that plus the skill set I learned as a program officer in the econ office of the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, I found have really helped my career going forward, because there tends to be, sort of, at each of the organizations I've worked at, there's public affairs officers who are really great at branding, messaging, communicating, and then there's program officers who are really great at running really great programs, and they have a really hard time talking to each other. And being able to work between those two spaces is really what I think how I got this current job. And I think it was Courtney that you mentioned networks and the importance of networks in getting your in advancing your career, and that was the case for me. Through the public affairs office, I had a lot of name recognition. Even though I was very junior, I was the person who was constantly sending the news alerts, moving the paper, clearing things. It felt administrative, but I could walk into any office in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs and say, oh, my name's Amber Forbes, I need X, and everybody knew who I was. And that helped me. I was actually offered a position in the econ office because they knew who I was, how hard I worked, and they wanted me on their team. And I was actually in grad school, and I went to grad school after that position, and while I was in grad school, the CEO of the Inter-American Foundation reached out to me and said, I really need a senior advisor. There's a number of issues that she just didn't have enough bandwidth herself to address, and wanted someone who understood the U.S. interagency space and the development space as well, and also had Latin American expertise. And I was like, I am that unicorn. And so it was because of those different experiences that I was able to get my current job, which I really love. But 10 years ago, when I was a senior at the University of Michigan, I didn't necessarily envision that career path for myself. I wasn't entirely sure what international development meant or how to get there, but it was something I figured out along the way. And having those networks and people to talk to, and doing informational interviews where I asked people what they did every day, how they got to where they were, and I slowly began to realize that, you know, there isn't this nice, beautiful straight line that, you know, you might look at someone's resume and assume, but people had very similar stories to the ones that we've been describing, and it was very encouraging that I also could sort of meanderingly find my way as well. And I think that's it for now. Courtney, do you want to?
Yeah. I would echo the same of what a lot of Amber and Fernando have said. I mean, I feel like a lot of times people have this perception that success goes in a straight line, but in reality it goes like this, and you just don't see it because of how people tell the story of what has happened to them. And honestly, depending on what you wanted to happen and what actually happened and where you are, you can tell a story about your life in any number of ways. And I think we need to be more transparent about what we perceive as our failures and their learning opportunities, so that people don't believe that they can just one day wake up and walk into their dream job, so that they understand that for all of us and for many of the people in DC and New York, the stories are similar. It just depends on how the person is talking about what's happened to them. So for me, I also had, in some respect, I knew exactly what I wanted for myself, but then I didn't necessarily know how that was going to look. I've known since I was a teenager that I wanted to do something to address malnutrition. It's always bothered me that the world has enough food to feed everyone, but there's still children dying of causes related to malnutrition. We know what to do to stop it, and it still happens. So that's something that has bothered me for years and years, and I knew that whatever I did, I was going to be on a trajectory that would be addressing the causes and consequences of malnutrition. So like I sort of alluded to earlier, what that looked like for me has sort of shifted a little bit. I spent a little bit of time in the NGO space. I wanted to get more toward the Policy Research Institute space, but I knew that I needed to stay sort of at the intersection between evidence and implementation, because I wanted to know that what I was doing was actually going to make a difference. I also think my experiences have been somewhat similar to Amber's in that I've also somewhat fallen into this space of liaising between a lot of different populations. And she's right, it's a niche, and it's a really important niche. I'm an economist that is communicating about nutrition and agriculture. So if I'm talking to a breeder, I need to know the right sorts of questions and things to be asking them. And I need to prove that I'm a trustworthy person. And if I'm talking to an advocate, I need to know what sorts of priorities they have so that I can say the right things so that they understand what we can do. Being able to do that is a skill. It's something that I'm sure that I'll talk more about as we go on, but it's been something that's been really fundamental in how I've proven that I'm a successful, worthwhile, important member of teams, because I'm the person in the teams that not only knows how things get done, but knows who to talk to and how to talk to them to make them happen.
Great, thank you all so much. So just building a bit off of what Amber has said, I'm wondering, what is a major obstacle either in your professional or personal life that you've had to overcome in order to achieve the professional success you enjoy today? How did you handle it, and how has it shaped your career? Again, for any of you.
Sure. I sort of alluded to mine, but before I go into a little bit more detail, I'll just say briefly that at least in my experience, I don't know if this is true for everyone, but I think if you want to sort of throw down in this international development, international affairs space, you sort of need to have three things to be competitive. And they are, you need language ability, you need travel, so like awareness of culture and proof that you have seen some of these things that you're trying to impact. You need work experience, and you need a graduate degree. And at least in my experience, for the sorts of things that I look at in terms of moving myself forward, those are the four things that kept coming up of like, okay, I'm not going to be able to get this if I don't have these things. But obviously, every person's experiences and situations determine in what order you get them. So for me, that was kind of my reality check. I sort of alluded to earlier, I started in a global service organization that was doing a lot of work around global health. And I knew that I was making a difference, but because I wanted to be solely focused on addressing malnutrition, for me it was kind of like, I'm doing really cool stuff, I'm helping other people do really cool stuff, but I I feel like I can do and be more, and I just need someone to see that. So having this experience and having like the opportunity to build skills, particularly those interpersonal skills, to find the ways to get things done and to be talking to people in the right ways. Not only did I develop the sorts of skills that I have needed to be able to be that person that people could count on to figure things out and get them done, but I also developed humility and grit, just because it felt in sort of that intermediary period of time that a lot of people were telling me, no, you're not qualified to do this, but really it was, you're not qualified to do this yet. So that was kind of a tricky period for me, because like a lot of them have alluded to, I fell into something that I didn't necessarily plan to do. I fell into communications, and then I learned that it could be a vehicle for gaining a lot of useful skill sets. And then I could sort of use it to move myself forward to get a little bit closer to where I wanted to be. So I just would say that everything that happens to you is a learning and growing experience, even if what you learn is that you don't want to focus in that part of a field, or you'll never do something that you see a manager do. Recognizing those learning opportunities when you see them is what is going to help you develop a healthy sense of self-awareness, so that you understand what you know and what you're good at, and what you don't know and what you're not good at. If you don't have this, it's really difficult to understand other people's perspectives and to grow and learn. Because if you think that you know everything already, then you're not interested in growing and learning. To me, this is one of the most important things to develop when you start out.
If I could jump on, 100% agree with everything Courtney just said. It's very similar to, I think, the professional challenges that I faced as well. Even entry-level jobs, looking at like needing 5 years of experience plus a graduate degree, and it's like, yeah, but how do you get that if, you know, it's entry-level? Like, how do you get the 5 years, right? The only thing I would add was for travel, at least in the some of the places that I've worked in and have been interested in working, travel wasn't enough. They actually wanted a solid year of living abroad, almost to provide legitimacy to your ability to work overseas, live overseas, understand other cultures, and work within them. So I think I'll focus on a personal challenge, and even though I'm going to start talking about it as a challenge, I really think it's an asset now, but for the longest time it was a challenge for me. I grew up very low income. I was a student on free lunches and Medicaid. I can claim being a first-generation college student. I did have grandparents on my father's side who went to college, but my parents are divorced. So coming to U of M was, I grew up just about a half an hour outside of here, so I knew I was going to go to U of M. It's kind of, I think, bred into everyone who lives near the University of Michigan. You know, that's just where you go to school. And I got here and very quickly felt like I didn't belong. I actually had a conversation with a student once. My sophomore year, I was explaining how I wasn't sure how I was going to buy books the next semester. I always ran out of money every year. And she was like, I don't understand you people. And she had this father who was really wealthy and just kind of gave her money all the time. And it really struck me and was like, oh, you know, I don't really belong in this space. And transitioning to the working world, especially in DC and at the State Department that is has a very formal culture, it was a challenge for me to transition to wearing a suit every day and feeling like I was, I don't want to say part of the oppressive class, but it kind of felt like that to me at the time. I felt like I was pretending to be something I wasn't. And I was ashamed of my background in the sense that I felt like it wasn't, it wasn't the experience everybody else that I was working with had, and it was something to be ashamed of. But I slowly, over time and meeting more people who had kind of come from similar backgrounds, I came to own my background a little bit more and really start viewing it as an asset, especially in the development space. Knowing what it's like to struggle with money growing up, even if it's in the United States, I feel like I can relate on a certain level to the people that I'm working with, whereas someone who is upper class their entire life might not be able to. And I'm comfortable working in those spaces. And so I've kind of learned now both to work at a very grassroots level, but then I can also function in high-level policy discussions or with ambassadors. And I think being comfortable with who you are, whether you've had different challenges growing up, and learning how to discuss those in a way that is empowering and empowers other people is really important, because it was actually a U of M professor later on in my career at U of M who is very open about his sort of lower class, blue collar upbringing that helped me understand, okay, well, if he's so open about it, maybe I don't have to be ashamed about who I was or where I came from. And finding more people like that. And at Princeton, it was a similar situation where Princeton is historically very wealthy. They didn't let women in until the 70s, so it's sort of very elite, very upper class, and a closed space to a lot of people. And a lot of folks felt very out of place, and we started organizing and found that in our class of 80 in our master's program, there were about 15 of us who could claim first gen or low income status. And we started talking to each other on like a bi-weekly basis about the challenges we were facing and how to use our experiences in the classroom to shed some light on some of the policy discussions that were taking place, so that people from low-income backgrounds weren't just being talked about, but that there were some people from those backgrounds actually providing voice to those conversations. And so I would just encourage any of you to, if you have similar challenges with, I guess, personal identity and the different aspects of yourself, the diverse aspects of yourself that you bring to the table, to share those and share them proudly.
Yeah, I will. I just agree with everything, in fact, that both Courtney and Amber have said. And I think to Amber's point, it took me a very long time to get comfortable with who I was and where I came from in spaces where that wasn't common. And I think the two key takeaways for me were, have you ever anyone ever walked past a room and gotten really curious what was going on inside, but not poked your head in or knocked on the door, or asked anybody, just be like, it's not for me, that's something really cool, but that's not my group. And I think that is largely how I saw so much of the world, was like through a keyhole when I was a kid. So I struggled in school, elementary school, middle school. I started to get it together in high school. You can imagine that was incredibly helpful to be able to make the transition to higher ed, but that motivated me. But at the time, I didn't think of it that way. Talking about obstacles, at the time, I thought, maybe this isn't for you. Maybe you're just not that smart. Maybe you're just not that disciplined. Maybe you're a genius, but you can't sit still for 5 minutes. So what difference does it make, right, to communicate with anyone? So I say that I agreed particularly with what Amber said, because she emphasized the point of how I obviously feel like that is a tremendous asset for me now, because it guided me back to the profession. It made me passionate about the specifics, the details, the research, the numbers, right? Things that I wouldn't necessarily have said, oh, I want to bury myself in, 30 years worth of educational data, right? To see if anything comes of it, right? Because I don't even know what I will find. But that kind of passion, that experience motivated me. But at the time, I wasn't sure how, as I said a couple times, how far I was going to be able to take education, or how successful I would be professionally, because I thought I had these limitations. And then, financially, I think being in spaces later, and just culturally, with people who had a different experience, who would say things, and I think, I can't relate to that. That makes me uncomfortable. And then having that experience of being like, maybe I don't want them to know that I don't have that experience. I can't relate, because I don't know how they're going to respond or react to who I am and where I come from. And it took me such a long time. I've told this story a couple times, but in different environments. I walked into interview for the job I have now 4 years ago, into the building, the HQ at JPMorgan, and I actually sat across the street for like 30 minutes talking to myself, asking myself, you know, should you interview for this? Is this, you know, do you want to walk in there? And I walk through those glass doors with all the security. The global HQ has tons of security, more than the other buildings that surround it. And the receptionist looking at you, and of course, I have to tamp down that voice that says there's judgment. Maybe they know. They're looking at me like, oh, that guy, get him. Push him outside. You know, he shouldn't be in here, you know. And so you know, I'm struggling with that up until a few years ago. But you know, where I come to when I overcome that, I think, is to remind myself I'm not a cliche. You know, thank goodness for anthro for me, right? Because one of the things I learned, at least from modern anthropology, with those of you who are familiar with some of its troubled past, was that I'm more than that. You know, to know people, to understand where they come from. So, yeah.
Great. All great answers. And, you know, actually your answers have sort of, have started to answer this final question that I'll ask you too before we open it up to the audience, but maybe you can expand, or you have something else you'd like to say. We're wondering if there's any one particular piece of practical advice that you would give someone who's just entering the professional marketplace. Are there specific strategies or tips that have worked well for you that you can share with us today?
I'll throw out two. These guys probably have a lot they can share with you guys. One, I think, is curiosity. The things you're curious about, they're often attached to things you care about, things you're interested in, experiences you've had. That can be a powerful guiding force in a practical way. I think it sounds vague, but you don't necessarily know, none of us do, the next job, the next scenario, the next organization. We don't know what it's like to work there until we've been there. We want to work on certain topics, certain projects. We want to have certain impact. But where you are in the teams, you know, it's difficult to know. Am I going to be comfortable there? Are they doing the kind of work based on what I can see externally that I think they should be doing? Will I be happy? So I think letting your curiosity guide you, right? You don't know, so it's best to spend some time finding out. You know, find out what is going on there, because that will help you learn yourself. It will help you learn what your environment is, okay? This is the right role, or this is the right org, the wrong role, the right role, the wrong culture for me, right? As you start to build that out. So I think it can be used very practically, you know, if you stick to that, especially with this whole question of like short-term and long-term goals and like, what's my 10-year plan and I'm gonna hit this bullseye. That's difficult, is what I will say about that. It's difficult.
I've never had a 10-year plan. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Yeah, and so I think allowing your curiosity to help you get from point A to point B is really powerful, and trusting in that, even when people on panels and in other environments will tell you, you know, your answer is that you're curious about something and that's who you are, that's what you're going to tell me. But, you know, trusting in that is important. And I think the second thing I would say is know your needs. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Don't be uncomfortable with what you need to do based on what your needs are, you know, what your financial needs are, what your morals, your values are, right? That's who you are, and don't, you know, be uncomfortable with following that line and pursuing that. So
I want to piggyback off of a couple things he said before I add a few things of my own. The first thing I want to just say is company culture matters a lot, and you don't realize that it does until you're somewhere that doesn't fit. So don't ignore things that don't feel right about the way that you see people treating other people. And then the second sort of quick follow-up is set your own boundaries. Don't ever expect anyone else to do it for you. The other thing I will say is just, so I am not trained in public health. I have a background in development and political economy, but for me, the way I got here is all about following my curiosity, improving my interest so that I could learn, so that I could learn by doing and do enough to prove that I had enough expertise to sit in the space and learn more. Based on that, and sort of also that same sort of, I'm not really where I want to be, but I'm getting there and I don't really know how that's supposed to go. I had a tendency, at least at first, to be quiet and to just absorb a lot of information. But I learned that a lot of times people that are really upfront about always speaking first, always being the one to tell you, I've done this before, I know how this works. If someone is fronting a lot of what they've done and what they think they know, they're probably bluffing. And what I've experienced is that when you're working around a lot of people like that, you can usually best them if you just come in and work really hard and ask the right questions. So the first piece of advice that I have is never, ever to let anybody's title or what they say that they've done in the past intimidate you from trying to do something. And related to that, just know, I mean, I think we've alluded to this a little bit, but know that all of us have imposter syndrome. Everybody that has, that's a high achiever has anxiety about where they are and where they want to go. But you can use them to keep yourself grounded and make sure that you're interacting with people authentically.
Yeah, that's really great advice. I think I'll piggyback off of what they said and then add something of my own. Fernando had alluded to sort of not feeling like you've failed if you end up in a job where you don't have the right fit. There is a saying in the Foreign Service, and so Foreign Service officers, they switch jobs every 2 years. And there's a saying that everyone picks their first job based on the location, because you have to do consular work. You're stamping visas, so you might as well stamp visas in like Rio or the Bahamas, or stamp visas somewhere really nice. And then on their second tour, you realize that you don't really enjoy your work if you're stamping visas, unless that's what you want to do. So they pick their second job based on the work. So you look for the job with your dream portfolio, whether that's political or economic related, public affairs related. Pick your job based on that. And then you realize that you can have your dream portfolio and still not like your job if your boss is a miserable person. And then after that, everyone picks their job based on who their boss is going to be. I had a very similar experience. Wanted to work in DC, got myself to DC, switched to the portfolio that I wanted, did not have a very good boss, and I was pretty miserable. I now have DC, I have an incredible boss, and I have my dream portfolio. I'm really happy. But I think your boss and the culture of the organization and who you are and your values and trying to match those, it takes some time, especially right out of undergrad or even right out of grad school. If you're going into a new field, it takes a little bit of time to learn the landscape. And so if you find yourself in a first job right after you graduate that isn't a great fit, it's a great learning experience. You've learned that you don't want to work in either that sector or maybe in that type of work. There's an entire spectrum of, you can make change at the macro level and affect change, but you're not really working directly with people and you might not see the change on the ground. Or you could be the person on the ground, but you're kind of beholden to the macro change happening above you that you're not really participating in. And neither of those is right or wrong. It's just kind of what you yourself are interested in and where you feel like you'd be happiest. And so that said, I'll add another piece of advice that might be more relevant for like immediately right when you graduate, especially if you're an undergrad. Your first job will likely have a decent amount of admin work, and it'll be a little demoralizing because you guys are super overachievers and you're the leaders and the best, and you'll have your Michigan education and you'll want to go out and change the world, and then you'll be like writing memos. But don't be discouraged by having to do some admin work when you first get out of school. And the faster you can prove yourself by doing that work really well, you'll be able to get out of it quickly. And I'll tell a very quick little anecdote about when I was an intern at State right after undergrad, well, technically still part of undergrad. I had started at the State Department a month before a massive conference that they were holding. They were bringing 70 women entrepreneurs up from Latin America and the Caribbean on like 4 different programs through different funding mechanisms. They were all different sectors of businesses that these women held. I think they were from like 15 different countries. And so a month before this conference, they're needing to get hotel rooms and flights and do a ton of logistics. And there was no one place where all of this information was stored. They were supposed to create a mentoring program for women who had more advanced businesses and the more junior businesses. And I couldn't make sense of it, and no one really knew what to do with me because, it was a month before go time and everyone was running around. So I took a day and just compiled all the information I could find, merged a number of spreadsheets, did some very simple administrative work so that I had like one place where I could find all of the information. I jokingly titled it the Master Tracker because I needed a way to make sense of things for myself. And then the person who was the point on this conference, when she started asking me for information and I could pull it up so quickly, she asked me where I was finding it, and I showed her this tracker that I had created. And all of a sudden, this tracker became the backbone of the conference, and everyone came to me for information. And I think to Courtney's point, not to let other people's titles intimidate you, I started getting better and more interesting work than the grad students who were part of the office. Even though I was an undergrad and they had several years of work experience, I showed that I could deliver and that I could produce results really quickly, and I had an eye for detail. And so I quickly moved out of admin work, and I was the point person for all of the communication to these women entrepreneurs coming up. I had a role within the conference itself, and that was one of my, I think, favorite experiences while working at the State Department. Even though it was an early one, just the transition that I was able to do in that month's time, because I took the admin work seriously, helped me very quickly get out of it and do something more important. So I think my advice would just be to, whatever is thrown at you, do it really well and show that you can do more, and you'll be recognized for that.
Wow, really great answers, all of you. Thank you so much for that. I guess now we will go ahead and open up questions to take questions from the audience. We've got Alana here with the microphone, so and Ashley also. So if you guys have a question, you can just raise your hand and we'll send them over. Anyone? Sure.
Hi, thank you all so much. My name is Yana. I appreciate everything that you've shared. I found it really helpful. I am a few months to half a year out from getting my PhD, which is in communication studies, but actually my dissertation is fairly applied, and I volunteer in 2 nonprofit boards, and so trying to orient myself towards something that is in a foundation, nonprofit, something like that. And so I struggle also similarly from what some of you had shared about your backgrounds, not having necessarily access to a lot of people, definitely not in my family or immediate other networks who have those degrees or those jobs or any of these things. And so feeling very uncertain about next steps, especially I think with a PhD, and how to sell those experiences or how to apply them and explain them to others, where I've already tried to make them as applied as it can be or make use of that space in that way and not be the super theoretical person. But trying to figure out, if I want it to end up like a program officer at some foundation, I probably won't get that walk-in straight out of grad school. But trying to also not get lost on some track that's leading me too far off somewhere else. So I don't know if, you probably don't have specific advice for me. And you've mentioned that paths go in very winding ways, but I don't know, maybe you have some, you've either from your own experience or you've seen people or something that you would advise to a more junior person wanting to end up somewhere like the places that you are.
I'm happy to start. So as I mentioned, I kind of ended up in communications right after undergrad on accident and was able to switch over to a more program type role. And I think what you've already done, you mentioned that you've tried to make your studies more applied, you volunteered in certain ways. That'll be a huge asset when you're applying and looking for sort of that first job that you have experience actually doing versus studying. But studying is very important, as Fernando had mentioned, being able to think critically and distill large amounts of information. That's kind of all I did at the State Department when writing memos. We were allowed 2 pages to explain the history of U.S. relations with Cuba, and you're like, okay, well, what do I put on those 2 pages? But as I mentioned before, I think informational interviews, people love to talk about themselves we're talking about ourselves right now. Ask people informally out to coffee. Half an hour of their time, ask them what they do, whether they're communications people or more program type folks. People switch careers all the time, and so if you start off in communications but work really closely with a program office wherever you end up, you'll be able to learn some of the skills that they also have, and then perhaps either transition there or maybe in the next job or organization you work with. Just because your first job is in a certain sector doesn't mean you are stuck in that sector for the rest of time. But whenever you apply to a job, it's good to reach out to people who work there to see what the culture is like. But even before you apply to a job, just reaching out to different organizations and people who work there, it'll help give you a sense of what that landscape is like and how you might fit in, whether that be a specific organization or a specific type of role. Don't be afraid to reach out to people on LinkedIn. I've actually had 2 U of M students reach out to me recently, I think because we're getting close to graduation. Had no connection to them before. They asked me if they could have a quick phone call, and I was happy to say yes, even though I didn't know them, because people did that for me. So I think people are always happy to pay it forward. If you're reaching out to someone too senior, they might not have the time because they're really busy. But if you're reaching out to mid-level folks who recently benefited from other people sort of showing them the way, I know I'm always happy to pay it forward. And these guys are here because they're doing the same.
Yeah, I would add to that. As you network, you're going to learn about these other networks, and that's important, right? An organization, they'll have relationships, they'll have pipelines. You'll begin to learn how board members meet each other, how they were recruited, and that way you understand, okay, so that organization is related to foundations or to other nonprofits in these spaces. The more I know about them, the better I position myself to be able to work with them, to be hired or to get on their board. And networking, I think Amber really hit the nail on the head with that. You also shouldn't be just caught up in your degree, meaning the title of your degree, not just because you can move through different sectors, you can do different types of work, but also because you have skills behind the degree that organizations may need as well. So you can find yourself in a space where both your knowledge base and the fact that maybe you can write, you just like, I'll take care of that. I'll be able to knock this out for you as well, particularly in a space where you're just getting to know people. Entry-level work is just another word for we don't know each other that well yet, right? And as you get to know them, they get to know you. You can build a situation where you have more responsibility, you can have more leadership, but folks need to get to know you. And so it's always good to I have a tremendous body of work and knowledge behind me. I'm bringing that to the table, and I know there's some practical things that you guys need, some practical support, and I'm willing to fill that gap as well.
I agree with everything that's been said. The last thing I'll add is that everything is interdisciplinary, as you've already identified. So if you can be the sort of person that, like Amber and I have been saying, is sort of translating knowledge between different fields, using those communication skills to be the bridge between these fields that don't really know how to talk to each other and don't have the right words, you can prove pretty quickly that you're an asset to people, because doing that also depends on building relationships and understanding other people's perspectives, and those are all skills that are important for success.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, my name's Yvonne. I'm an undergraduate student. I was hoping you guys could share a little bit about the lessons you've learned from just adapting to new locations and how you kind of assimilated to different work cultures, etc.
The thing that I think was honestly, once you do it enough, you don't think about it as much anymore. The thing that seems like it's a big transition is when you go from like the Midwest to a coast, because then you are in a more densely populated area, you're not driving, you're using public transport, and that sort of changes how you're thinking about what you need to do and how you go about your day. But the source of skill sets that a person who's thinking about global careers and has that sort of global mindset, those are the sorts of things that you need to assimilate wherever you go. Because you're observing, you're asking a lot of questions, you're paying attention to how other people are doing things and why they might be thinking about things in a certain way. And those are the sorts of things that you need to be able to adjust and live in a new space.
Yeah, I would just say, to build on that, when you're in that space and you have a sense, make sure you always keep in mind a sense of what you want out of the experience and what you are willing to give, because that's where you mentioned boundaries before, and you have to set them. To quote you can't wait for other people to set them for you, because in many cases they won't, as many of us know from different working environments we've been in. So if you've set them and then you know what you want to get out of that experience, you kind of know what your longevity could potentially be. Every day you learn a little bit more, every month, every year, but you have some sense, right? I'm willing to go this far, I'm willing to do these things, and this is what I need to get out of the experience. I think that's important, because we've all had experiences, and work is no different than any other environment where it's like, man, I'm having an issue with this person. I'm struggling with conflict resolution, either with an individual. I'm not sure whether we're going in the right direction as an organization. I'm concerned about decision-making, anything that will cause you stress or conflict, and cause you to ask yourself, is this the right situation? Am I myself behaving in the way that I think I should be behaving? And so there are smaller ends of that spectrum as well, like, do I have to dress a certain way? Do I have to go out after work because that's part of the culture? Do I want to do things like that? And knowing, okay, I'm going to continue to stay in this space because I want to gain a couple of more things, want to learn a few more things, but maybe this isn't where I stay. I think those are important.
Just for some actionable, practical advice, one of the things that I did right after I moved to DC, I connected with the University of Michigan Alumni Association, and nobody told me to say this, but they put on events, and they had events for young professionals, and my two closest friends, actually, it's been 10 years now, but we met at an alumni event. They were both from Michigan, went to the University of Michigan. We didn't know each other while here because this university is massive, but we just understood each other in a certain way. I think just having had that Midwestern upbringing, having gone to the university and finding ourselves in DC, we bonded really quickly. We rifled through each other's closets a year into living in DC, realizing that none of our Midwestern clothes were appropriate for DC business attire. And there's a million different ways to connect with other young people and people who aren't from wherever you end up with having your job. There's meetups for everything under the sun, whether it's, you like wine, you like hiking, you like salsa dancing, you like nerdy board games. You'll find people who are also new to the area, looking for friends, want to connect. If you are into sports, that's another great way. When I went to DC 10 years ago, everybody was joining kickball leagues. Now I guess axe throwing is a thing.
Yeah. More and more cities.
Who knew? But it's a great way to meet people, have something that you look forward to once a week to connect, and then even though you're bonding over sports or wine or dancing or whatever, you'll find that you can share some of your challenges through the workplace, learn how people are addressing things differently in where they work, or even maybe you're sharing similar challenges even though you have maybe one person's working for a nonprofit and another person's working for government, but you're both dealing with a difficult boss, and you can share sort of strategies for how to relate or cope or manage up. So I'd just say once you get somewhere, just know that there's a lot of people also looking to connect because they also are new. You'll probably feel like freshman year all over again, where you're looking for friends, or if you were from Michigan and you had a lot of high school classmates that went to Michigan, you might all of a sudden feel like it's kindergarten again. You're like, wait a minute, I'm 20-something now. How do I make friends? But it's a lot easier than you'd think, especially in bigger cities.
Hi. Amber, one of the things that you had mentioned about your experience when you were interning and you noticed that there was a lot of information kind of here, there, and everywhere, but you wanted to centralize that. When I heard that, I immediately thought of creating value for the organization that you were working for. And so myself, also in my final year of graduate school, and I actually studied anthropology myself during undergrad. I would like to know kind of what strategies and/or tips or what have you that, and this is also applicable to the other speakers as well, for creating value. And I guess what I really mean to say is, how do you look for an opportunity where you can hone in on something that an organization might be experiencing? And the reason I bring this up is because oftentimes nonprofits are experiencing a lot of different challenges, not only just along the lines of communication or organization, but interpersonal relationships and what have you. And so I would like to know, like, what kind of strategies that you have or that have developed to hone in on a specific thing within the entity that you can add value to, that can help take you, not just promote you per se, but that can help you advance more in the entity.
That's an excellent question. I think early in my career, it was often kind of looking at those like streamlining challenges or centralizing information with some pretty practical and just like low-tech solutions. It may be, I think it's the government, this is all in my personal opinion, not speaking on behalf of the US government, but sometimes the government lags behind the private sector in terms of what software they have available. And so, the information that I was collecting, that was just an Excel spreadsheet, super low tech, something that I just had time to do. I created a survey monkey to survey these 70 women entrepreneurs and created some questions that spit out graphs that were then in Excel, and everyone oohed and ahed and thought it was like the most revolutionary thing that I had created some graphs to talk about how these women entrepreneurs had changed over the years since our conference. And so I'm sure a lot of you have used SurveyMonkey or something similar just in social planning. So sometimes things like experiences you have that might not even seem like they're directly applicable to the workplace can be. But then to talk more about what I'm doing now, I think my entire job is kind of how you described it in terms of like, how do you add value? Being a senior advisor to the CEO, my entire role is looking at sort of some of the processes that are in place that may be antiquated or based on previous directors and that don't really work, and figuring out how to modernize them, streamline them, make them work for the agency, and so that the systems are working for us versus us working for the systems. How to save time, how to increase efficiency. When the CEO brought me on, knowing that there's only 40 people in this organization and everyone's very passionate about what they do, which is a huge benefit to the organization, but because everyone is so passionate and so they identify with their work so closely, it can be very personality driven as well. And so when I was brought on board, I told the CEO, in order for me to be effective, I'm going to have to spend the first 2 weeks getting coffee and be very highly caffeinated, but in order to create change at an organization, you have to create buy-in. And so I couldn't come in as this new person and say, okay, that's not working, let's change it this way, and there would have been mutiny. And so I very slowly built relationships, identified challenges between offices that were hindering collaboration. And I play a very unique role in the sense that I can talk to all of the staff at more the junior or working level, but I sit with all of the managers when the CEO has her directors meeting. And so I find myself translating frequently sort of what the folks at the working level are saying that they may not feel comfortable sharing with their supervisors, and bringing that to the attention of the managers to say, okay, so there's this issue. I won't throw anyone under the bus or like say names, but several people have identified this. Here's what I propose to solve it, and then we work together to implement. And I think there's a million different ways you can do that. So I'll turn it over to you guys. Maybe you have a different way to answer the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't have too much to add. I think that was very comprehensive. That to Amber's point, a lot of times, and you reference this as well, people will tell you, right, what the capacity issues are, or it will be readily apparent. Ideally, we'd like to be able to do this. Ideally, we'd have the ability to also aggregate this data or look at that, particularly in nonprofit spaces. And it's like, but we just don't have the capacity. We don't have the ability to do that. And I think, you know, just having your notepad or what have you, and really taking a look at that list, because in a lot of spaces it probably won't be, to your point, 1 or 2 things. It might be 10 things. And then pulling in and keeping in mind your strengths. You know, for me at least, that was incredibly helpful, is focusing on what are some of the areas that I'm strong in, and looking to see are there weaknesses there, because then I can bring to bear kind of experience and a desire to do it. I appreciate efficiency and workflow a lot. It doesn't mean that I'm like stomping around about it all the time, but I know that when I'm in a staff meeting or I'm listening to a process and I think, wait a second, you know, I hear or see something that could probably be a little bit faster, a little bit easier, right? I know ease is important, you know, in a practical sense, that's what efficiency means. So I gravitate towards that interest, but I'm also always taking notes. Particularly for me, I've done a lot of transition in my career, and that meant that when I talked about people not knowing me or me having to prove, like, what is your value in this space? I've done a lot of that. So I think, you know, Amber touched on meeting with people, buy-in is critical. The first thing I thought when she started to talk about the question was like, the last thing you want to do is say, I've got the answer. If it's something people are struggling with, you know, you want to get into that conversation about what are we thinking, you know, what are some of the things that we think we could approach and how we could do it. So I think buy-in is probably the most critical thing. Amber touched on it. And then trying to find trying to utilize your strengths and listen to people when they say there are 10 things, you know, we wish we could do, and then thinking, all right, I'm going to figure out a way to make 2 of them happen.
I would add, if you can figure out how things work, or at least figure out who knows how things work, you will be very essential very quickly, because people that are focused on specific priorities or on things that are at a higher level, they'll learn to come to you when they need to figure out how to make something happen. The other is, again, related to what they've both said, building relationships, so that when there are situations when priorities come up or the context in which something can be changed come up, you have the knowledge because you've been sitting sort of in between those spaces, especially if you're in a situation where you are listening to people from a lot of different disciplines or people from different countries, and you can sort of translate the context in which they have been experiencing something to help other people who aren't aware of what's going on better understand how the decisions that they're making are affecting what other people are doing. If you can do those things and sort of sit in between a lot of people, you're going to be, and know the answers, or at least how to get them, you're going to be important fast.
Can I double dip real quick?
Yes.
Something you said reminded me of, so I mentioned the public affairs job that I had, where I had a lot of name recognition. Part of that was because I was the person who knew how the clearance process worked. I knew how to move paper through the State Department, and I was available. So I sort of built this reputation for knowing how things work and being at my desk and answering the phone if people were confused or needed help immediately. And I think that went a long way. And even now in my current role, just being available for staff to come to me with issues that they're facing, knowing that I'm receptive and I have the ear of the CEO, or can address issues when she doesn't have the time to or needs to focus on other things, has gone a long way and has helped build that buy-in, build that trust.
Yeah, just to throw one other thing too in there is that to be even more specific, you know, they both talked, Courtney and Amber both talked about this. Find somebody in the space. Somebody needs help with something. And you can do that. I think one of the problems with that sometimes, it can seem so transactional that it seems insincere. Like, oh, I'm just going to find somebody and like, oh, I'm going to help you out because I'm trying to get something. But if you've applied to an org, if you have any interest in it, it's because there's something going on of value. Find that individual. There's somebody you want to help in that space. And that you know, if you're looking at how do I target, how do I start, you know, but that's how you begin to build buy-in. That's how you begin to establish your own brand in that space. And also both Courtney and Amber in particular with her anecdote touched on this. Every place needs more data aggregation. Every place needs to record better. There's no place you can't go where you can't say, okay, so they're not able to aggregate this or record this. They're not able to be the keeper of this to a large point. What Courtney said, be the person who knows, and you just stake it out. And tactically, I would say, if you can find a project that you can kind of tuck in your back pocket, so that it's not necessarily what you lead with in the staff meeting, because maybe you have a ton of other things to do, or maybe you came in with something, but you know, I'm going to keep turning this over and over in my head. I'm going to work on it maybe for 15 minutes each day. And then one day you'll be able to come and say, you know, or continue to create that buy-in, talk to people. I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking maybe we can do this. That's a great way to try to push in the direction of what Amber had happened to her professionally, which is to be like, hey, I created this database because I needed to be able to do this, and everyone would be like, wow, that's great. We can utilize that.
So thank you again so much to our three panelists for taking the time to join us today and share their stories. And also thank you to you all in the audience for the questions and for engaging with us. We'd like to now invite you all to join us for a short reception. So thank you again.